I don't even know how to really, words fail me to describe what an incredible pleasure and honor it is to be welcoming Brian Goldstone back to FAN. Our first encounter with Brian was on Zoom almost a year ago when the hardcover copy of There Is No Place for Us came out. We hosted him on Zoom with Kianga Yamada-Taylor, incredible program. And when we knew about the paperback, and I said, so can we host him for paperback in person? And when we got to yes, it made my day. Brian Goldstone is a journalist and author of this book, published last year. The book was a finalist for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. It was named one of the 10 best books of 2025 by the New York Times and The Atlantic, and it was selected as one of Barack Obama's favorite books of the year in the list that he puts out every year. Brian's long-form reporting and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, and the New Republic, among many other publications. He received his Ph.D. in cultural anthropology from Duke and was a Luce ACLS Fellow in Journalism, Religion, and International Affairs. Prior to that, he was a Mellon Research Fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia University. Brian is the recipient of grants and fellowships from New America, Fulbright, the Wenner Glenn Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. In 2015-16, as a Justice in Education Fellow at Columbia, he taught at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. It is beyond a pleasure for you to have the pleasure of a keynote address from Brian Goldstone.
Hello, hello. It is such a gift, such an honor to be with you tonight. As Lonnie said, I had the privilege of joining FAN last year, and I've done, I don't know how many events I've done over the last year, virtual, in person, but that was truly memorable. I told my spouse, Elaine, after it was done, I said, wow, that was amazing. And she said, I thought it was just a virtual event. I said, no, that was not just your typical virtual event. There were after hours with fan insiders, donors. I mean, the depth and care of the conversation was so moving to me. And so, of course, I jumped at the opportunity to be here in person. So thank you so much, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts during the Q&A and afterward. And I also just want to say thank you for being willing, with all of the things you could be doing tonight, willing to come and open yourself to the difficult realities that we're going to be discussing. In the fall of 2018, when I first met Kokethia Goodman, she and her children had already been homeless for about 3 months. Their protracted nightmare began after the house they had been renting in a gentrifying neighborhood in Atlanta was sold to an investor, and their lease was abruptly terminated. They couldn't afford anything nearby, so they moved to a different rental on the outer periphery of the city. But just 2 weeks later, Kokethia heard a scream from the kitchen. Her 12-year-old son, DJ, had been severely shocked by exposed wiring while washing the dishes. The property was soon condemned, and before they knew it, the family had nowhere else to go. When Kokethia shared this story with me, she was still in a state of disbelief. It wasn't just the circumstances that had deprived her family of housing. It was the fact that they had become homeless despite her job as a home health aide, and she returned to this point again and again as if she couldn't wrap her mind around it. Like many of us, she had been taught to believe that homelessness and a job were mutually exclusive, that if she worked hard enough and stayed on top of her responsibilities, if she just clocked enough hours, she might not make it rich, but she would at least find a modicum of stability. And yet here she was, wearing her bright blue medical scrubs and checking her phone every few minutes to see if any shelter beds had opened up. I wrote about Kokethia and her kids for a magazine article, but after I finished it, their story wouldn't let me go. And as I kept reporting on housing insecurity across the country, I started seeing the same thing everywhere. In Northern California, I saw safe parking lots full of workers living in their cars and minivans. I met people who had worked their entire lives and were now disabled and unhoused because their disability checks didn't come close to covering housing costs. I met men and women who did airport runs for Uber and Lyft during the day and then slept in those same cars at night, using gym memberships to shower. And it wasn't long before I met the 5 families whose desperate struggle to secure stable housing I've sought to document in this book. The book is based in Atlanta, and I reported it over a period of nearly 6 years. Drawing on my training as an anthropologist, I basically immersed myself in the 5 families' day-to-day lives, spending as much time with them as I possibly could. This methodology was crucial because it seemed important to show people in the fullness of who they are and what they aspire to be, not just showing them in their most anguished moments, their moments of crisis, as so much reporting and academic research on insecurity and poverty tends to do. But equally significant, this approach stemmed from a conviction that before we can fix this crisis, we first have to feel this crisis. We need to know what it feels like for parents, for their kids, when one of the most basic human necessities is always just out of reach. Just like Cokeithia, what each of these families are forced to confront, ultimately, is the reality that in America today, having a job, even 2 or 3 jobs, is no guarantee that you'll be able to have a home. The phrase working homeless seems contradictory. There's something scandalous about the idea that these 2 words, working and homeless, could go together. And part of why it's so jarring is because it upends our prevailing assumptions about work and homelessness alike. Yet my book argues that in many ways, this is becoming the new face of homelessness in the US. People whose paychecks simply are not enough to keep a roof over their heads. There are a few statistics that very succinctly show why we're seeing this alarming trend. Here's the first one. Today, there isn't a single state, city, or county in this country where a full-time worker earning the local minimum wage, which is often higher than the federal minimum wage, can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Let that sink in. Since 1985, rent prices nationwide have exceeded income gains by, get this, 325%. The result? More than 12 million renter households are now classified as severely cost-burdened, spending on average an astounding 78% of their income on rent and utilities alone. And as many of you might be aware, economists have long defined affordability in terms of not spending more than 30% of your monthly income on housing costs, so 78%. In other words, 12 million households for whom the slightest setback or unanticipated expense can be disastrous. Now, you might assume this problem would be most acute in the poorest parts of the country, but the opposite is actually true. It's in the richest, most rapidly developing cities that the threat of homelessness has become especially dire. In these places, it's no exaggeration to say that a low-wage job, increasingly gigified or contracted out and stripped of basic benefits, is homelessness waiting to happen. We see a similar pattern. Unemployment remains low, corporate profits are surging, the signs of growth are everywhere. And yet the delivery drivers, daycare workers, supermarket cashiers, even teachers and social workers who help sustain these cities are being relentlessly priced out of them, and increasingly out of housing altogether. Nor is this harm evenly distributed. It falls overwhelmingly on communities of color. In Atlanta, a city that is no longer majority Black, a staggering 93% of families experiencing homelessness are Black. And here in Chicago, in the Chicago area, although Black residents make up less than 30% of the population, they account for roughly 70% of those who are unhoused. And it's important to note that these statistics did not arise overnight. There is a whole history of displacement and discrimination and dispossession behind them, going all the way back to Reconstruction and continuing through redlining and restrictive covenants and exclusionary zoning laws. For a growing number of Americans, the greatest danger isn't that they'll lose their job. It's that their job will never pay enough, never provide enough hours, never offer enough stability to keep them housed. One of the perverse and really paradoxical dynamics I point to in the book is that what we're seeing today is a crisis born less of poverty than of prosperity. It's wrong to say that all these families and individuals are falling into homelessness, like they just stumbled into it. They're being pushed. They're the casualties not of a failing economy, but of one that, by most measures, continues to thrive, just not for them. One of the people in the book, Britt, a mother of two whose roots in Atlanta go back 5 generations, bears the brunt of these forces firsthand. The title of the book actually comes from Britt. Several months after being displaced and left homeless, when her apartment complex was demolished to make way for luxury condos, she returns to the site where new shops and restaurants are already appearing. Gazing at a sign with a gleaming artist's rendering of the new development, she says, "Wow, this will be really nice when it's done." And then she kind of catches herself. She remembers her own state. She says, "But me and my kids, there's no place for us here." I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed over the last few years who, as they've been confronted with the bleak arithmetic of stagnant incomes and out-of-control housing costs, have cut back wherever they can. But eventually there's nothing left to cut. And then they find themselves languishing in this kind of shadow realm, living in their cars, the overcrowded apartments of others, or in exploitative extended stay hotels and rooming houses. By shadow realm, I mean that these families and individuals are homeless, yet they've been rendered invisible, not officially counted, largely ignored by policymakers, and often written out of the story we as a country have told ourselves about homelessness. Driving around our cities, we see the encampments, we see the makeshift dwellings under freeway overpasses. But those are just the most visible manifestations of a far more pervasive calamity. There's an entire world of homelessness that we're not seeing. The tents are just the tip of the iceberg. And in many ways, to continue with this iceberg metaphor, my book is about everything that's beneath the water's surface, hidden from view. Even as I argue that all of this, the encampments, the hotels, the cars, is just one giant iceberg, a whole spectrum of insecurity. So, as I mentioned, the book follows 5 families, and each of them, with their unique backgrounds and circumstances, illuminate a specific aspect of this larger phenomenon. But tonight I want to tell you about one family in particular, the Walker family, Celeste and her 3 kids. Celeste is a 46-year-old woman who grew up in Tampa and has now lived in Atlanta for many years. Confident and super smart, she's charismatic, has a great sense of humor, and she carries herself with an air of invincibility. Like whatever challenges are thrown her way, she's going to figure out a way not just to get past them, but to thrive. But on an afternoon in May 2018, a chain of events began that would prove insurmountable even for her. That was the day she received a frantic phone call from her neighbor saying her rental home was on fire. She had just picked up the kids from school after leaving her warehouse job. By the time they made it back to Westover Drive, their house had been completely destroyed. They lost everything. Their only possessions were what the kids had in their backpacks and a few hampers of dirty laundry Celeste had thrown in her car that morning, intending to go to the laundromat after work. Investigators later determined that the fire had been set by a man Celeste had broken up with a few months earlier, who she had just taken a restraining order out on for harassment and stalking. He was soon arrested for arson. While the family was still reeling from this tragedy, Celeste started looking for a new place for them to live. She was confident that they'd be able to rent an apartment relatively quickly. But after a couple of days of driving around and scouring listings on Zillow and apartments.com, her optimism evaporated. It seemed like the ground had shifted under her feet. In recent years, Atlanta had undergone a much celebrated renaissance, with scores of newer, wealthier residents flocking to the city to enjoy its transformed urban landscape, new green space, new hotels, everything you can sort of picture, the trappings of gentrification. But during the same time period, median rents had soared by 76%. And Metro Atlanta had lost over 200,000 affordable rental units. Neighborhoods that were once affordable for people like Celeste had suddenly been revitalized, pushing property values up and poorer residents out. But it wasn't just skyrocketing rents. It was also the issue of simply applying for an apartment. Atlanta's competitive rental market had enabled landlords not only to raise rents, but to tack on exorbitant application and administrative fees, which had to be paid up front and were non-refundable, even if your application was rejected. In Georgia, one of 39 states, including Illinois, where there is no limit on what landlords can charge to process applications, these kinds of fees had become a routine way of extracting money from tenants. Celeste was aghast at what properties were charging. One complex was demanding an admin fee of $200 in addition to $75 for the application itself, meaning it would cost $275 just to apply for this one apartment with no guarantee she would be approved. Given her limited savings, like 44% of Americans, she had less than $1,000 set aside for an emergency. She needed to be extremely selective in which apartment she applied for. The idea of casting a wide net was out of the question. Celeste began asking friends and coworkers to allow her and the kids to sleep on their floor or on their couch or in their basement for a few nights at a time. And so that summer, as May turned to June and June turned to July, they bounced around from place to place, sleeping in her Dodge Durango when they had nowhere else to stay. Well, these nights were horrible for Celeste. She worried that the police would find her and the kids asleep in the vehicle and call Child Protective Services. And actually, this fear was justified. Nearly a quarter of child removals in Georgia, as in many other states, are because of, quote, inadequate housing. Sometimes during these long, uncomfortable nights in the car or on someone's floor, Celeste and the kids would watch videos on her phone, taken at the home they no longer had. There was the video of 7-year-old Mecca, who Celeste called her big teddy bear, which he hated, getting his treasured Spider-Man pajamas on Christmas morning. Or the video of 14-year-old Jalen smiling his big electric smile after performing a rap song he'd just written. Or the one of 16-year-old Naya cuddled with her brothers on the living room couch. It was hard for Celeste to believe that the life she had built for the 4 of them, the stability they had found, had so quickly disappeared. And then, after months of all this, she finally found an apartment that seemed promising. She applied, paid the application fees, and prayed. A few days later, she was shocked when the leasing agent, who had been very friendly, called to say she had been denied. "Why didn't you tell me about the recent eviction on your record?" he asked, clearly annoyed. Celeste said that was a mistake. There hadn't been any eviction. But it turned out she was wrong. Eventually, she pieced together what had happened. Back in May, when her house burned down, she had reached out to her landlord, which happened to be a private equity firm called the Prager Group. Celeste asked them if she could move into a different rental in their portfolio, and they told her that in order to break her lease at the burned down property, she would first have to pay not only the current month's rent, the fire had happened at the beginning of the month before she had paid her rent, but an additional month's rent as well, and she would lose her security deposit. Celeste hung up in disgust, and she thought that was the end of it. What she didn't find out until later, after learning of the denial from the leasing agent, was that the Prager Group had filed an eviction against her for non-payment. She drove to her old house on Westover Drive, which still hadn't been repaired, and inside the mailbox she found an eviction notice. The sheriff who had left the notice in her mailbox a couple of months earlier wrote at the bottom that it was, quote, served to fire destroyed property. Celeste then drove to the courthouse where a clerk told her that when she had failed to file a response to the eviction notice within 7 days, a default judgment had been handed down against her. So she had been evicted without her knowledge from a home that was uninhabitable. This was crushing news for Celeste because she realized that the eviction on her record, which had also ruined her credit score, a 3-digit number that has come to determine whether millions of people in this country will have access to something as fundamental as a place to live. She realized that this could end up being even more devastating than the fire itself. It could haunt her for years to come. At this point, Celeste had run out of options. She had exhausted her list of friends and contacts willing to let her and the kids stay with them. Recognizing that now she wouldn't be able to get approved for any apartment, she did what countless families in similar situations, families who belong to what might be called America's credit underclass, are increasingly doing. She went to an extended stay hotel where no credit check was required, just cash up front. Across the country, extended stay hotels and motels have become critical nodes in the ecosystem of American homelessness. These places essentially function, I came to realize, as for-profit commercial homeless shelters, charging outrageous weekly rates for substandard, often hazardous conditions, while offering none of the tenant rights or protections that come with formal housing. Sometimes they say the only thing worse than being a tenant in America is not even earning the designation tenant, as these families do not. The proliferation of these extended stay hotels and motels is no accident. In fact, I was astonished to discover that today Wall Street investors and private equity firms are not only buying up vast swaths of the nation's rental properties, like the one Celeste had been living in, but they're also cornering the market on the very places where people go once they lose their housing. Blackstone and Starwood Capital and other private equity giants have moved aggressively into the extended stay market, betting billions that amid a national housing crisis, this model will only grow. The logic is brutally clear. As more and more people are deprived of housing, extended stays have rushed in to exploit the gap, capitalizing on the precarity of those with nowhere else to turn. And many of us are familiar with the famous line about how extremely expensive it is to be poor in this country. And what my book really shows, I think, is the flip side of that equation, how extremely lucrative, how extremely profitable all this insecurity has become for some. This was certainly true of Efficiency Lodge, where Celeste and her kids found themselves because it was the cheapest hotel around, even though their cramped, studio-sized room was more than double what she had been paying for her old 3-bedroom rental home. During their first several weeks at Efficiency, Celeste and the kids actually felt like it was a kind of refuge. They no longer had to worry about where they would be staying from one night to the next. And even though the four of them were crammed into a tiny room with Celeste and Micah in the bed and Jalen and Naya on the filthy, threadbare carpet, they tried to make the best of it. In fact, Celeste had always dreamed of opening her own restaurant. She even had a name for it, Passion Foods. And when she saw that the hotel was located in a food desert with no grocery stores and only fast food places nearby, she started operating a makeshift restaurant out of her room on days she wasn't working at the warehouse or after getting back at the end of a shift. Armed with just her trusty crock pot, a microwave, and her kitchenette's grease-encrusted stove, Celeste charged $10 for a large serving of whatever she happened to be preparing that day: shrimp fettuccine, fully loaded nachos, turkey chili, and her specialty, smashed potatoes with a side of salmon. That was also my favorite. Her neighbors at the hotel began lining up to get a plate of food before it sold out. Celeste had no intention of staying at Efficiency Lodge longer than a month or two. Her plan was to save what she could and pay off her eviction debt. But this plan was derailed by yet another wrenching turn. She started experiencing an array of vague but persistent physical symptoms, and soon she was diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer. She started chemo, which left her nauseated and bone-tired. Her body was screaming at her to stay put, to rest, but like many jobs in our new labor economy, her employer at the warehouse offered no sick leave, and she knew she couldn't afford to miss a single paycheck. The hotel began to feel like an expensive prison. Complaints about a broken air conditioner or a leaking ceiling or rodents or rampant mold were always met with a version of, well, there are plenty of others who will gladly take your place. I can't tell you how many times I heard that sitting beside the manager in her office. Available rooms at Efficiency, like at the other hotels in its vicinity, were exceedingly scarce, and management wielded this fact like a weapon. If one family left, there were always 3 or 4 others waiting to rent their room. Many residents used the phrase hotel trap to describe their predicament. With no other options, they were caught in a semi-permanent state of limbo. Every morning, school buses arrived at Efficiency and the other hotels lining Candler Road to pick up kids who had lived there not for months, but for years. There were people who had been there for so long that the hotel address was on their driver's license. Nobody wanted to be there long term, but they knew the alternative, if they failed to pay their weekly rent and got locked out of their room, was even worse. In this respect, the only thing scarier than being stuck at a place like Efficiency was not being able to remain there. Celeste often thought about the hotel motto she'd seen behind the manager's desk when she first checked in. The sign read, "Stay a night or stay forever." Now this motto seemed less like an invitation than a threat. Because of her illness, Celeste realized that her plan to pay off her eviction debt and move into an apartment was impossibly out of reach. Before the diagnosis, a social worker at Micah's elementary school had given her a homeless resource list. Celeste resisted calling the numbers, not only because it was hard to accept that the word homeless could apply to her family, but because she hated asking for help. But her fear of getting trapped indefinitely at Efficiency now outweighed the embarrassment of pleading for outside support. Pride and dignity, she decided, were luxuries she could no longer afford. So one day she fished out the paper and began dialing. The refrain she heard again and again was that before she could get housing assistance, she first had to go to Gateway Center, the city's primary hub for homeless services. Most cities have their own version of gateway, a place where scarce resources are parceled out in a triage-like manner. A few days later, Celeste woke up at 4:30 in the morning in order to be at Gateway before the sun rose. She'd been told that since intake interviews were conducted on a first-come, first-served basis, people often began lining up in the middle of the night. Still, when she arrived downtown before dawn, she was stunned to find a long line already snaking down the sidewalk. After hours of waiting, she finally entered the building, clutching a folder with hotel receipts, pay stubs, birth certificates. In a windowless room, a caseworker began a standardized assessment. Had Celeste ever been diagnosed with a behavioral disorder? HIV/AIDS? Had she been arrested? Used drugs? Tried to harm herself? No, 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 Celeste responded. She tried to explain the cancer, the eviction, her fear for the kids. I can see the toll this is having on them. I can see the toll this is taking on them, she said. But her words seemed to have no effect. The assessment was over in a matter of minutes. The caseworker looked up and sighed. She said that unfortunately, Celeste's vulnerability score was too low. Even her cancer didn't render her vulnerable enough to qualify for housing aid. And because she wasn't living in a shelter or on the street, she didn't meet HUD's definition of literally homeless. In other words, she wasn't homeless in the right way. And I just want to pause at this scene for a moment because what was playing out here is absolutely crucial to how we understand homelessness in America. Versions of this same encounter play out every single day at gateway-style intake centers across the country. Different buildings, different cities, but with the same questions, the same rules, and usually the same outcomes. HUD's definition effectively ignores how the vast majority of people, especially families with kids, experience homelessness. In cars, on couches, in hotels and motels. And this narrow definition doesn't just determine eligibility for services, it also shapes our sense of the true magnitude and breadth and nature of homelessness in this country. And that, in turn, affects our vision of what meaningfully addressing the problem ought to look like. Before something can be counted, it has to be defined. And one way we have managed to both reduce homelessness and obscure its root causes is by defining people like Celeste out of existence. This exclusion was by design. In the early 1980s, when mass homelessness first erupted across the United States, the Reagan administration made a concerted effort to shape how it was perceived by the public. Officials realized that the narrative needed to be controlled. Otherwise, it could lead people to conclude that this humanitarian catastrophe, for that's really what it was and is, was due to structural issues like the gutting of public assistance programs or the fact that the nation's budget for low-income housing had just been slashed. And so very quickly, individual pathology became the dominant frame for understanding homelessness. Federal funding for social science research on the phenomenon was limited almost exclusively to work that foregrounded mental illness and addiction to the neglect of other factors. This lopsided research agenda, as one historian of public health has referred to it, led both academics and policymakers to focus disproportionately on a relatively small sliver of the total homeless population. Now, to be clear, then as now, nobody denied that some of the men and women most visibly suffering on the streets were struggling with mental health issues or addiction. But these conditions on their own do not deprive people of housing any more than a fever causes the flu. In fact, one thing that became very clear in the course of my reporting is that mental illness and substance use are often the consequence of homelessness, not its cause. Yet framing homelessness as a problem of individual pathology made it less politically threatening. It obscured the socioeconomic roots of the crisis and shifted blame onto its victims. And this effort at shaping public discourse, it was actually successful. In the late 80s, the New York Times and CBS News surveyed people at random, asking them what they thought caused homelessness. Most respondents said alcohol, drugs, or psychological problems. Others said laziness and unwillingness to work. Nobody mentioned housing, not a single person. Meanwhile, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population at that time were children under the age of 6. Over the next 2 decades, homelessness came to be seen as tragic but unremarkable, a seemingly permanent fixture of the cityscape. Fixated on the individual, it became the purview of charities and nonprofits, more a question of pity and compassion than of justice and injustice. At the same time, the interests of advocates and government officials began to converge on a definition of homelessness that was deliberately narrow and circumscribed. For advocates, this was a matter of moral urgency, ensuring that limited resources were targeted at those considered to be in the most immediate need of help. For political leaders, it was a matter of expediency. The more contained the problem, the easier it was to tackle, or to claim that it was being tackled. By 2005, when the point-in-time count, the annual homeless census, was established by HUD, a small but conspicuous fraction of the total homeless population had come to stand in the public imagination for homelessness itself. Everyone else was written out of the story. They literally did not count. Over the last few years, through new research, we've been able to get a glimpse into just how vast the chasm is between the official number that makes it into newspaper headlines and the actual number of people experiencing homelessness in this country. Once we include those living in cars, hotel rooms, or doubled up with others, we're talking a population larger than the official figure by a factor of 6. So about 4 million men, women, and children without housing right now. In the state of Georgia, where I live, and you would see the same dynamic in pretty much every state in the country, if all those left out of the federal homeless census were to gather at the stadium where the Braves play, and this is just those in Georgia who are excluded from the official count, they could fill the stadium nearly 3 times over. Back at Gateway, Celeste was told that to qualify for help, she would need to enter a shelter. Fine, Celeste said, we'll go to a shelter. The caseworker, though, had more bad news. She said that since Celeste's older son, Jalen, was 14, he wouldn't be able to go with Celeste, since the women and children's shelter didn't allow boys over the age of 13. The only way Celeste could be eligible for assistance was to split up her family. So Celeste left the building with nothing. When she walked outside, the line was just as long as it had been that morning. She shared with me one of her journal entries from around that time, written in her hot pink diary after the kids had gone to bed. God, you know my heart, and I know you promise to never leave me nor forsake me. And I know you say don't worry, but I'm human, and the nature of my flesh is to do so. So I'm just asking for you to give me the strength to make it through this. It doesn't have to be this way in America. Ours doesn't have to be a society where people clocking 50 hours, 60 hours a week still can't meet their most basic needs. or where parents have to sell their plasma in order to keep their families housed. It doesn't have to be a place where children, because of unstable housing, are made to suffer what public health experts refer to as toxic stress. Linger on that phrase, toxic stress. Stress so chronic, so debilitating, that it can fundamentally alter a child's long-term development, choking off their future before they've even had a chance to begin. James Baldwin once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Confronting the true severity of this crisis can seem overwhelming. Housing precarity has become an ever-widening sinkhole, swallowing up not only the poor and working class, but vast portions of the middle class as well. When we consider how shockingly porous the line is becoming between housed and unhoused, when we consider just how many families are one medical emergency, one rent hike, one missed paycheck away from losing their homes, it can feel paralyzing. I felt that too while working on this book. But alongside the suffering, I also witnessed the many ways people are showing up for their neighbors. People like L.A. Pink, one of the book's heroes, who had the least to spare, but consistently gave the most. She practiced what I've come to think of as a radical availability, a presence that restored dignity, allowing people so often made to feel invisible or degraded to know that they were seen and heard. All of us can embody this same spirit of solidarity simply by putting ourselves in spaces where we encounter need and meet it with what we have. But individual acts of solidarity, as vital as they are no substitute for systemic change. There are many avenues of action, and they can be grouped, I think, into two main categories: getting people into housing they don't yet have, and keeping people in the homes they already have. That's how you end homelessness. The first involves everything from banning predatory application fees and biased tenant screening practices to expanding the voucher program, dismantling restrictive zoning laws, and ultimately making a massive public investment at the actual scale of the need in the creation of high-quality, permanently affordable homes. The second focuses on stopping homelessness before it starts, halting a relentless churn that in some cities sees 4 people lose their housing for every 1 person who secures it. This means guaranteeing the right to counsel in eviction court, strengthening tenant protections, enacting just cause eviction laws, and providing direct cash assistance to renters on the brink. In other words, making eviction prevention as much a priority as housing production. All of these steps are crucial, and they point to a bigger argument I would like to end with. Whatever solutions we pursue, they have to be grounded in nothing less than a paradigm shift in how we think about housing itself. As I mentioned earlier, I have a background in anthropology. And in Anthropology 101 courses, we often say the point of the discipline is to make the familiar strange, to take what's unexamined or taken for granted in our everyday lives and see it anew with fresh eyes. Nowhere, I would argue, is that more urgently needed than when it comes to housing. In this country, it's simply assumed that housing is a vehicle for accumulating wealth, that it's basically a privilege. If you can afford it, you can have it. And if you can't, well, then you're left to fend for yourself in what a case manager in the book, Carla Wells, calls the housing hunger games. Some of you might remember in the early days of the pandemic, 2 brothers in Tennessee who were widely vilified for driving around to every Dollar General they could find, buying up hand sanitizer, and then reselling it online for $50, $60 a bottle. There were calls for them to be prosecuted. They made the front pages of newspapers across the country. And I remember thinking at the time, This is exactly what we've allowed housing to become. We've allowed this precious, essential resource to be hoarded up, packed into a giant U-Haul, so to speak, and then sold off at whatever prices people are desperate enough to pay. But we don't call that by its proper name, profiteering amid an undeclared state of emergency, fueled by manufactured scarcity. We just call it the law of supply and demand. We just call it the market. I guess my hope is that we can all become anthropologists, drop down into our society, into this richest nation on the planet, and ask, how have we allowed this to happen? How have we allowed the housing Hunger Games to become our status quo? Because once we frame it this way, once we recognize how strange, how utterly bizarre it is to treat housing as a luxury good auctioned off to the highest bidder, we can begin to see a safe, stable place to live for what it truly is, as a basic human necessity, indeed as a fundamental human right. This idea of a right to housing, it's not some outlandish concept. It's actually been a core principle for countless social movements, and it is enshrined in law by many of America's peer nations. The right of every family to a decent home was even a major part of FDR's proposed Second Bill of Rights after the Great Depression. A few years later, housing was included alongside food, clothing, and medical care in Article 25 of the Declaration of Human Rights. We know what happens when people have access to affordable, dignified housing. Children begin to flourish in school. Physical and mental health improve. Just as housing insecurity ripples outward like a corrosive substance, so too stability produces far-reaching consequences, strengthening families and communities alike, reminding us that when we extend the promise of home, and we might add a living wage, to those who have been denied it, everyone is better off. Homelessness is neither inevitable nor intractable. It's a choice, one we have collectively made as a society. And this is actually good news, because it means we can choose differently. We can choose to stop this devastating trend. We can choose to become the kind of cities, the kind of country, where nobody has to say, as Britt did, that there is no place for us. Thank you.